Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to write the research methods section of a dissertation or doctoral project. Now, this is something that comes for everyone who's doing a doctorate. At some point, you need to describe what it is you're doing, how you're doing it, and why. Now, depending on your discipline, this may have a more specified, formal organization, or it might be more freewheeling. If you're familiar with a humanities dissertation, those tend to have more thematic structuring, whereas a social sciences or health sciences dissertation or doctoral project tends to follow a more particular form. And in ACU's doctoral programs, we follow a 5-chapter structure, of which chapter 3 is the research methods, or if you prefer, the research method and design chapter, which we abbreviate as research methods. All right, so today we're going to be following 4 foci. First, we're going to understand the why of a research methods chapter. Why is this information here? What are we trying to do with it? Then we'll look at the main sections of the research methods chapter. We'll look about where to look for detailed guidance on each section, depending on your program. And we'll finish with discussing some of the common errors and how to avoid them. So with no further ado, let's dive in. And I encourage you to ask questions as we go along, because these webinars are offered for the benefit of students such as yourself. And if you have a question, chances are someone else is interested in the answer as well. And if you have a specific topic that you want to suggest, by all means, go ahead and type it in the chat room. Or if you are more private and don't want to share that with the whole group that you're asking it, just send me a private message. So let's talk about the whys of the research methods chapter. Well, the first off is something called validity. And validity comes from the Latin word validus, which means strong. And so validity in the research sense is the extent to which the things that you're doing in your study, its key concepts, the conclusions, the measurements that you make of things that become data, how well-founded, how well thought out, rational, justified, and thus how likely are they to produce information that is applicable to the real world, that corresponds to the real world, that accurately reflects things in the real world and how to make them better, how to address a problem, etc. If you don't have validity, then it's hard to tell whether your results will be truly useful and effective. So chapter 3 gives us, the readers, a basis for judging the study's validity. Because if you give us a clear and precise description of what you did and how you did it, why you did it, with the rationales built in, with citations to the literature, with explaining not just what you did, but why that was appropriate for what you're doing, that gives us an idea of your validity. And we can break that down into things like describing what you either will do at the proposal stage or afterwards in your revising, what you have done to answer the answer the research questions, to indicate how those things were done, to justify those choices you made, explain the results, how they will be interpreted or analyzed. And you could understand this again as describing the materials that you used, how they were chosen, explaining how they were chosen or prepared, giving the research protocol, the set of steps you followed, explaining the measurements that will be, again, if the proposal stage, or were made if we're looking retrospectively after your defense, and what calculations or analysis will be or was performed, and what tests, how do you make sense of the data? And there are a whole bunch of different ways, and you might use them for different reasons, depending on your audience, depending on the population or geographic area that you're studying, and other things like that. So let's talk about some of those detailed sections. First of all, the introduction. Yes, every chapter is going to start with an introduction. There's not going to be any heading because there's an APA rule saying don't start with a heading that says Introduction. And this is going to be fairly focused, perhaps 1 to 3 paragraphs, and followed by a number of sections that are more open-ended in length, where first you state explicitly what your research design and methodology are. This is going to be things like, oh, in this qualitative multiple case study, I will blah. Or in this correlational study, or in this quasi-experiment, you're telling us how you're doing it, and those things will correspond to the 3 basic types of methodologies, which is to say qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. Mixed methods being a combination of qualitative and quantitative. Now, there are a couple things like you can have qualitative case studies and you can have quantitative case studies, but for the most part, most of those labels for specific research design are only qualitative or only quantitative in nature. And so you'll state the specific thing you're going to be doing, and then you'll unpack what that means with more details. Population. This is, in brief, who it is that you're studying, or what it is that you're studying, what group, what collection of things, and what is, when you find whatever it is you find in your project or study, what are you going to use those to try and improve or change? Now, it would be difficult in most situations to gather together the entirety of a population to study. Even in a small town, if there are, say, 100 people living there, it can be hard to get them all agree to participate and give data, in part because people fall sick, people are reluctant, some people don't want to go with the mainstream, and they have their own time and priorities. So instead of recruiting an entire population, in most cases, you're looking at a subset of that larger population that you are collecting data from in some shape or form. And so that will be your sample. Now, both the population and sample sections are open-ended in length. In many cases, 1 paragraph is enough. Sometimes there's some particulars about the whys or wherefores or the constraints with accessing them, especially if you're dealing with a protected population. Now, the materials or instruments, how are you going to be collecting data? For example, a survey instrument, a set of questions that people are asked, that is an example of an instrument. How are you going to collect and analyze that data? Is it going into an online form? Is this something where you're going to have things spat out in numerical fashion or otherwise coded fashion, and it goes into SPSS to run statistical analyses? Are you going to do something like in vivo coding, where you look for themes? What are recurring themes when you're analyzing, say, transcripts of interviews you did with people? Now, in the differentiation between the 5th area here and the 6th, between materials and instruments and data collection and analysis, we have a little bit of a source of confusion here, because the instrument for a data collection could be a questionnaire, but could also be something like having open-ended interviews or semi-structured interviews. So there can be a little bit of crossover in what you discuss in these 2 sections, but data collection is, if you will, how you prepare or make sense or organize the information that is then analyzed. Now, the procedures section, the procedures is where you go into some more detail about how you are making sense of that data. So, for example, if you have a survey or some sort of measurement that's taking place, what is that tracking? So if you're doing quantitative research, you would have a number of variables. They could be independent variables or dependent variables. And if you're doing qualitative research, you want to describe in this section what methods you're using to establish trustworthiness. And trustworthiness happens in more than one way. And trustworthiness can involve things like member checking, where you go through your notes to look for consistency. It could be something where you have multiple parties doing coding, where they look at it and analyze it. And if they disagree, then you can look at it in more detail. There are a variety of things, but the idea is that you have a systematic way that you have set out in advance to make sense of things. And of course, the exact steps that you'll follow at each stage or with each participant for consistency. Now, the researcher's role or role of the researcher section is about what you will do directly. And this is in part because in some cases, you might be physically collecting the information from people. You might be in the room asking questions, or you might have a third party do this. You might be asking people questions and writing the answers down on a form. You might be asking them questions and summarizing the notes as you go. You might hire someone else to do these things. I was doing research with a group in the Malagasy rainforest. And, the head researcher did speak some Malagasy, but there's a difference between full scientific fluency and a working fluency. And so they had members on their team that were doing some of the questions and the interactions. And it's important to document that in part because if you have someone who is a native speaker involved, they are more likely to catch things than someone who has acquired their fluency later on. Now, that is just one small example of things why it might be important to specify the researcher's role. Another one is if, say, you are interviewing people who are in your line of report. Now, that's not to say you can't do that, because there is certainly a lot of research where people do interview their subordinates, but one has to recognize that there are potentials for bias or potentials for self-censorship in that. And so by acknowledging these and the steps that are taken to mask this or to provide comfort, attention, etc. So for example, you might be the person who's asking the questions, but I've seen a setup, for example, where the person asking the questions could only hear by a microphone, and they were writing things through a voice modulator, so the sound was distorted, so you couldn't hear what someone's natural voice sounded like. And so that's a way where they were able to be the person asking the questions and the follow-ups, while also protecting the identity of the participants and making them more likely to be forthcoming and honest. Ethical considerations? Well, if you're doing something like that, there is definitely an ethical consideration to make sure that employees aren't being pressured to participate, that there's no fear of reprisal. And keep in mind that the fear of reprisal is distinct from an actual threat. If someone has a fear of reprisal, rational or not, merited or not, that can influence their results just as much as an actual cause for that. And ethical considerations also include things like data protection. You want to protect the participant privacy. In fact, I would say we are all required to protect the privacy of participants and their data, and that will go in the ethical considerations section. Next come a set of 3 related things: assumptions, limitations, and delimitations. And we'll talk about these a little bit more later. But basically, the assumptions are the things that you hold to be true. So for example, a common assumption when you're interviewing participants is that they will be forthcoming. That they'll say things that hopefully will be useful, that they'll say things at all, and also that they will be honest. Now, there are ways that you could make it a less likely assumption to be true. So for example, if we're paying people $50,000 to talk about their secrets for success, and that might attract people who are not actually who you're trying to recruit, who are attracted by the $50,000, because that is a lot of money for most people. And there'll be a lot of incentive to lie about meeting the various requirements that you have for the study, because that's so much money. So, for example, if you are given compensation, and here you might detail how it's assumed that the compensation will not bias people because this amount has been used in similar studies, and then you cite the similar studies. Limitations and delimitations are also closely related to those assumptions. We'll do delimitations first, even though in the outline for the EDD program, you do that normally after limitations. So the delimitations are the boundaries in your study. Things like excluding and including. So for example, if you have a set of delimitations around your study in terms of geography, you might say, oh, I will only recruit people who work at the school district. So everyone who works in that, they fall within the delimitations, but everyone who doesn't work there, they're outside the box of what is of interest, what is being examined, what is fair game. Now, that can cause limitations. So a potential limitation resulting from that is if I'm working only on this particular school district, my results may only be good for that particular school district. Even if I have 100% of the teachers in that school district responding, if they do compensation and hiring differently at this school district than the one next door, my results might not be applicable there. And a common one is if there's some aspect of geography or taxation or something like that, that prevents a free interchange and creates different conditions. So for example, I used to work at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, that's located in Hamilton County, Tennessee. Now, Hamilton County is located across the mountains from most of the rest of the state. So even though there's a county immediately to the west, you have to go around the mountains. And a lot of people don't want to do that much driving. Now, there are people from nearby Georgia who come in, so my results might be generalizable, that is applicable to, relevant to the people in nearby Georgia, but because the people in Tennessee aren't crossing the mountains, it might not be representative. To give another mountain-related example, if I was studying rainfall in Hawaii, depending on if you're on the windward or the leeward side, you get a lot more rain or a lot more sun. And that means that you might never water your garden, or you have to water your garden or everything dies. So these differences do matter a lot. And so you want to be clear about your delimitations, because that may cause limitations on how your findings, how your results are applicable to other things, to other scenarios, to other locations, etc. And then a summary section. People usually don't have the summary section, don't have problems there. If they do, it's because they write more than they have to. Generally, 1 to 3 paragraphs is fine. 6 pages would be way more than you need. So let's talk about the introduction, because that's another section that you can write far more than you need. You want to briefly introduce what it is that you're working on for the benefit of the readers who are turning specifically to that chapter. And you want to briefly state what the research design and context of the study are like. Oh, this quantitative correlational study of blah, blah, blah takes place at this type of research site in this location, and it's designed to do whatever it is. That can be a couple sentences, maybe a paragraph, 2 paragraphs max, and then give us an outline listing the major sections of the chapter in the order that they come with. Now, this last one will be a very boring paragraph to write, because it's just listing essentially the sections within the chapter, but it will tell the reader who's turned to that chapter what they need to know about what is in the chapter. And that is a valuable thing. And again, it'll be very boring, but easy to write. And so just write it and move on. Okay, so let's talk about where you would look for guidance on these different chapter sections. Well, depending on your program, you might have a different set of information. Now, the EDD program has a document called the EDD Dissertation Content Guidelines, and that lays out in great detail which sections in which order and which sections for which type of study. So if you're doing quantitative versus qualitative, you will have some different sections in there. The DMP program, because of the fast-changing nature of health sciences, prefers to present a couple what we call project exemplars. These are examples of DMP projects that have been written up and being described by the faculty as, oh, these are worthy of study. You can also go to the ACU Digital Commons, that's a last link here, to see completed published dissertations and doctoral projects from ACU. And that's a great idea to see what kinds of things other people put in, the level of detail that they went into, because you can see, oh, yes, this was approved by a faculty committee recently. So let us go ahead and we'll take a moment to step away from the slide deck, and we'll go ahead and look at the EDD dissertation content guidelines. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And because this is a PDF, I will zoom in, and our purpose here is to first introduce you to the document, and second, introduce you to some of the specific elements within it. Now, if you are looking at your screen, now you should see I've got this document shared, and you can see it is based in part on providing examples that correspond visually to the EDD dissertation template. Now, it starts with chapter 1 and marches through chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Our purposes here is to talk about the research methods chapter, so we're going to skip chapter 1 and 2 and go right to the discussion of chapter 3. Now, a key thing that is important to keep in mind, before you have done the research, you will be referring to the things that you plan to do in future tense. So I will study, this project is designed to do X, it will collect, I will recruit a minimum of 20 participants for this. All that is in future tense for things you haven't done yet, but plan to. Now, after you have passed your proposal defense or your prospectus defense, depending on your program, once you have gotten that approval to do research, you start converting these to past tense to reflect, oh, these are things that you actually have done. Now, don't worry about that until you're working on chapter 4 and 5, because some of those details may change. But by the time you have the complete 5-chapter manuscript, your chapters 1 to 3 should be reflected to say retrospectively what you did. Anything that says, I will do that, you can have that for talking about follow-up research plans, but if it's something you actually did, that should be changed to past tense. Now, one of the things that this document does is it goes ahead and it will give you the heading in the order that the heading should occur, and then it will talk about the things that should be in there. And a little bit of note here, you'll see some comments like, substantiate the appropriateness with rigorous citations. So it's tempting to use a course textbook like Creswell's Research Methods book as your main way of grounding this. That is an introductory research textbook. And even better than that, a supplement to that is to use recent research. Because no matter how good that book is, being able to find models that you can say, oh, this specifically relates to what I am doing. Here's an example of a study just last year that did this, and here's what they found with a similar sample size. You can be much more specific and thus much more rigorous in the use of sources for citations. And if you're having trouble finding those sources, make an appointment at our library team, because we deal with those all the time. I used to be a library faculty person, and people come in, and librarians are experts on finding things, and they can set you in the right direction really quickly with helping you find those supporting sources for that specific thing. Now, within the larger things like quasi-experimental study or qualitative case study, there are a lot of differences about how you might be recruiting people, how you might be assessing them, what your criteria are. And that's why we have this whole section on it, to expand on some of that stuff and give us the big picture of it. And you'll see that there is a table here that has been excerpted to show some of the examples of the different ways that information can be collected and processed. Now, we have a separate webinar where we talk about the different research methodologies, what those are, and some details. this is where you describe them. Now, the next section, population, and you can see that it gives you a number of things to identify. Give a description of the population, the estimated size of it, and relevant characteristics. So suppose you're looking at the United States and like, okay, the relevant population is the adult population in the United States. Okay, how many people is that? How are you defining that? You're probably defining it as 18 and over, but there are other ways that you might define being an adult, like, oh, can they drink? In which case it might be 21 and over. So that's something you should tell us here. And even if you're using archival data, things that have been previously collected, you should still describe the population that represents. Now, I mentioned earlier that the sample size is something where it will vary a lot depending on what you're doing. And the best guide is to go with the literature and to not use the smallest estimate. If someone recommends 8 to 12, I wouldn't plan on recruiting just 8. That's awfully small for most types of research. And a common mistake here is that people will copy and paste material from the population. The population and the sample are not the same. More on that later. The sample is a subset of the larger population that you recruit with the goal of getting a representative sample. All right, now there's some notes here about if you're doing the quantitative sampling versus qualitative, what information should be in there, as well as this description of if you're doing quantitative research, you should be describing the materials or instruments that you're using. Is this something that you have created yourself? If so, how did you test it? Is this something that you acquired from the published literature, that you licensed from a company? And how did you make sure, or how do you know that it is likely to be helpful or useful in this context? Has it been used in a similar population? Was it recommended for this? Is it the standard in this field? Questions like that are things you can answer here. If you're using a number of different survey instruments in combination, that's also something you would want to do and to describe. Sometimes it'll be talking about how these have been used in another context, how they're recommended for that by other authors, or even in how you went about testing to make sure it was reflective. So it's very common to make a shorter survey and then test to see whether it gets similar results to the longer form version. And it's not to say the longer form version won't capture more data, but that might not be data that you care about. You might be perfectly happy with what the shorter form one goes because that's enough information for you to act on for whatever it is you're doing. When I spent time working in the emergency room, there's a lot of stuff you could ask someone, but if they are actively bleeding out, it's probably less relevant. So how are things in your childhood, and more focus on okay, so anything we should know, any metal parts inside before we put you in the MRI, or, how did this happen? How long ago? Things like that. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might be condensing, you might be altering, you might be updating an existing instrument or instruments. And instruments can include things like questionnaires too, or observation notes. You could do video or other media analysis. And however you're collecting this data, you're going to be writing it up. If it happens to be quantitative data, then you're going to need to be describing your variables. Are they independent variables? Are they dependent variables? Are you combining a number of things to produce a variable? Are you going to be doing things like interpolating for missing data? These are all types of things that you might be writing about in this section. And then the procedure steps, this is talking about from start to finish, what are you going to be doing? And you get your data to answer your questions and determine whether your hypotheses about what the answer might be are correct or not, are proven, sustained, or disproven, as the case may be. Qualitative, we won't go into too much detail here because the basic idea is the same. It's just some of the little details about what you're describing and how it's treated. So for example, qualitative, you might have to have a step where you go in and you code the responses as, oh, this is happy, positive, this was negative or something. You might do word frequency analysis. You might create themes, things like that. We kind of talked about methods for establishing trustworthiness. That's usually going to be relatively short, less than a page. Occasionally it's longer if there are significant ethical or privacy considerations. So for example, when people are talking about difficult situations, then you may need to go an extra mile for anonymity. You might have to do more, talks to tell people about the steps taken to protect them. Things like discussing the details of your informed consent process might end up in here. Research role, we talked about this, what are you doing? What are you bringing? Do you have particular expertise or insight that would be relevant to mention here? And then we talked about these different sections before, but again, the limitations that affect how these results might be done. And those limitations might be the result of your delimitations, and they might be the result of things that are entirely out of your control. So for example, people who are doing the research during the COVID-19 pandemic's emergency phase, going in and interviewing everyone in person and reading their facial expressions, a little hard to do with masks and social distancing and everything like that. So there may have been something like that, and that helps tell researchers who come after you what you did, what you didn't do, and how they might improve or follow up on your research. And then the summary section, again, it's usually pretty easy for people to write. And the main problem is if you write way more than is required. Brief summary of these key elements. All right, so let's take a look now back at our slides here. So we could go through the D&P process as well. And I will tell you, spoilers, that what we're going to see is going to follow a basically similar arc here. But let's take a look. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. So we're looking in the ACU Digital Commons. Anyone can access and download this. This is one of the dissertations that was identified as an exemplar to use for study. And if we look at our table of contents here, chapter 3, you'll see that they are restating the purpose. That's not a problem. A lot of people do that in their introduction. Describing the project design. So that will be our research design and methodology, the instrument and tools, data collection and analysis. Because a D&P project is almost always working with human subjects or human subject data, it definitely needs to go through the IRB approval. And so while that might be in some studies collected under our ethical considerations, here, because it's such a common element, it is a separate section. And we have a discussion of the informed consent form and risks and benefits. But although these are organized slightly differently in terms of names, it's basically going through all the same beats as we were discussing just now. Now, if we're to go ahead and take a look at, say, the instruments and tools section, so that's on page 25. And we see, I, a nurse educator, provided, that's past tense because they've done the work. I, a nurse educator, provided in-services dementia and dementia care to the experimental group. So it's laying out, okay, they were the person doing that. The in-services included, and then they list these things. And then they go on to talk about how they did it, what they used. So they had a computer, a microphone, and a TV. And they list the video that they showed, and that they were able to use that because it was freely licensed for educational purposes. And then they go on and they say, oh, yes, they used this instrument, DKAT2, which was specifically developed to measure caregivers' nursing knowledge. Well, since that's what their project is about, that's very suitable here. So they tell us, hey, we're using this, and here's why. And then they give some more detail. Oh, it's a questionnaire. There's 21 questions and a scoring system. Some more about the approach that it does, and then how this has been tested and validated in the past, which in this case includes these stats show good internal consistency and an acceptable level of reliability. And it concludes with, therefore, because of all the stuff mentioned before, I use DCAT2 as an assessment tool to evaluate the nursing staff's knowledge of dementia and dementia care. So when I mentioned earlier that looking at a model of an approved piece of research, whether a doctoral project or a EDD dissertation, it makes it very easy when you look and see, oh, that's what they wrote. This is something that has been approved by the university. Now, given your topic and the particular work that you are doing, this section might have to be longer or shorter, but the starting point of, hey, let me get a ballpark idea of the level required by looking at a sample, very, very helpful. And again, the ACU Digital Commons is available. That's that last link there. You can also search for ACU dissertations online and it'll come up as the first result. It is available for you to browse anytime. There's no password requirement or anything like that. And so you can look at things. I would recommend looking at research and examples because the requirements do change over time and some of the expectations do as well. So just look at things from the last couple of years and you'll have a great companion to the guidelines that are provided. We're going to finish up by talking about some common errors that often I have faculty sending students to work with me about for chapter 3. So number 1 is confusing the research population with the research sample. Now, you'll usually just see this shorthanded as population and sample. Again, research population and research sample. So the research population is the larger collection of some group of people or things that you're studying. You know, your population could be the residents of a city, it could be employees of a district, it could be teachers who meet X qualification. The population can be bounded by things like geography, ethnicity, race, citizenship, age, and other categories. But the idea is that it is the group that has the problem that you're trying to address, with the thing that you're trying to improve or are otherwise influenced by it. So your problem is relevant to them in some way, shape, or form. And so in this section, you should be describing the population and their key characteristics that make them relevant to your work and why it's appropriate for your study or project. Now, let's compare that to the research sample. The research sample is a smaller subset of the population that you're going to be actively trying to recruit from, because you might be doing a study about teachers in, say, the state of Texas, but your research sample, you're recruiting locally from, say, the 3 school districts within an hour's drive. So that would be the smaller subpopulation that you're trying to recruit the sample from. And the sample will be almost always smaller than that because getting 100% of any group is difficult. Ask anyone who's tried to get a group of friends together for a road trip or something like that, or a party. Usually not everyone you ask shows up. And so the sample, these are the ones that you're actually able to recruit or get information from. Now your sample should be large enough that you can get findings that are likely to be relevant for the larger population that you are studying and trying to improve things for that has the problem, but also a reasonable bit. If you are holding out for 95% of the participants, you could be waiting a very long time. So, how much is enough? Well, look at the literature, see what other people have found, and aim a little bit higher than the minimum. So you should be stating whatever that target sample size is, the justification of it, and how you're going about recruiting them. Are you using something like snowball sampling where you ask people to share it? Are you doing more purposive sampling where you go and seek people out and kind of recruit them directly based on your knowledge. And there are pros and cons for each, and there are many other methods of sampling as well. You tell us which one you plan to use and why. And by the way, people do sometimes use a mix of different sampling methods to try and diversify and expand their pool of participants. The participants being the individuals who make up the sample. Delimitations and limitations, we did talk about this earlier, but again, delimitations, these are the boundaries of your study or project, and these establish what you will and won't examine. And there are practical decisions that allow you to complete your work in a timely fashion. If you didn't have any boundaries, you could be recruiting forever. Or you could be trying to track or interact with everyone in a position, but they keep getting replaced. So, time is a very reasonable delimitation to have. Same as geography, you might be looking at people who meet certain criteria. Versus limitations, the limitations are the weaknesses resulting from delimitations and some external factors that may reduce the generalizability or application of these results to a setting or group. So for example, if we delimited your study to only recruit men, well, your results might be less generalizable to women. And this is something that comes up in medicine, actually, where it turns out that if you test a drug on only men and only men of a certain, say, height, weight, build, activity, it might work great in people who meet that exact characteristic. But for people who don't have as much muscle or have a different genetic heritage and different digestive enzymes, or for women who have a different proportion of muscle mass and energy requirements, it might work differently. And so how you choose those delimitations is going to be the largest determinant of what those limitations are. Because if I delimit this to geography and I'm recruiting from, say, in Washington, D.C., it's tremendously diverse as the United States goes. But if I was, say, recruiting in, let's say, Augusta, Maine, nothing against Augusta, Maine, but Augusta is in northern Maine. And in general, you will find that the people there are from a less diverse and more homogeneous background. And so if, say, we are testing sunblock there, they're probably going to be fairly white as they go. We might conclude, though, the sun is so weak, the sunblock didn't really do anything different. Well, if we went down to Atlanta, Georgia, I don't care if their skin was white or not, they're probably going to need and benefit from some sunblock more. So that's an example of how a geographical delimitation may cause some limitations on your findings. Another common one, so APA style states not to use the words the researcher to refer to yourself. You're not supposed to refer to yourself in third person, but in particular, the researcher, don't use that. You are allowed and encouraged to use I and me and my to specify when you're talking about yourself and your things. You can introduce that you're doing things in the first sentence in a paragraph and then continue in third person. That's all right. That keeps the focus on the things you're doing versus on you, which is, it might be an accidental outcome if every sentence starts with I did, I will, I have. But again, don't use the researcher, because in some cases you might have hired a researcher and then we're not sure if you're talking about yourself or about that other person. So that concludes our planned talk today. Just to recap, we started out by looking at the question of why is the research chapter? What are the things that make it important to describe how you're doing your research or how you did your research, depending on if this is the proposal prospectus stage or if this is working on your completed final manuscript. We also talked about the main sections that make up the research methods chapter. Again, there's some small variation in between how these are called, how these are labeled sometimes between different doctoral programs, but the essentials are the same in terms of what kinds of information is there. Just sometimes it's slightly a different organization. We talked about where to look for detailed chapter guidance on what should go into each section. In the DMP program, you want to look at exemplars of recent doctoral projects. And in the EDD program, you want to look at the EDD a dissertation handbook, or sorry, the EDD dissertation content guidelines is a technical name. And then we talked about a few common errors, some places where people get confused. And that's, I think, all the time we have for today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can go to my.acu.edu and schedule an appointment. Do be aware that we recently updated my.acu.edu. So actually, before we wrap up, I'm going to show you where to look to find the Writing Center materials on the new My ACU. So if we go ahead and go to my.acu.edu, it's very different from the old one. For one thing, there's a lot more white. It's following the ACU color scheme. And if we're looking here on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a variety of ways that things are sorted. And to get to the Online Writing Center, we want to look down under Tools and select Academic Resources and select Show More Online Writing Center down at the bottom. That's what we get for starting with O. We're last on that list. Now, there's some other things you might be interested in. So for example, if you wanted to use our site license and download Adobe Photoshop, you could go to Adobe Creative Cloud. If you're looking to get some access to Grammarly to just run through some things with your with reviewing your manuscript before you submit it to faculty, you could go to the Grammarly Premium link. But in our case, we're interested in the Online Writing Center. And so this will bring you to this landing page. You can go directly to our website from here, watch this video on making an appointment, or go right to schedule an appointment now. You can also go directly to our Writing Center website using this link. And with that, I will say thank you for joining us. Have a good night.